Welcome to The Business. Hello, I'm Tet Kofi, and in this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. Welcome to The Business. And in the news this week, South Africa's National Planning Commission warns the country it may need help from the IMF. Zimbabwe aims to de-dollarize the economy by reintroducing local currency bank accounts. The price of oil is projected to reach $100 per barrel as US sanctions against Iran start to bite. And after a 13-year suspension, Ethiopia seems to be back in the World Bank's good books as the bank agrees to provide $1 billion in budget support. Now, joining me to discuss these items and provide a much valued insight is journalist and African commentator Vuyiswa Gobongwana. And in part two, I'll be troubleshooting alternative business models with global thinker and renowned economist Andrew Nevin. South Africa's National Planning Commission has issued a warning that the country may need help from the International Monetary Fund if her rising debt continues unchecked without the buffer of savings or new sources of tax revenue. Can't help thinking, Vuyiswa, that we've been here before, at least other African countries have.
Exactly, and you know, as a South African, the most significant thing for me is that South Africa has never been here before. But I see this as a symptom of the new era that the government is entering into, you know, more transparency, which is something virtually unheard of.
But it's been an unhappy story for other countries that needed budget support by the IMF and the World Bank in the past. How can South Africa avoid falling into that hole?
I think the National Planning Commission raised this up to basically, in a very gentle way, let the nation know, hey, there's an emergency coming here. And if they do go into IMF hands or management, so to speak, we know how that scenario can play out. But what that will do, I'm feeling, is act as a catalyst for South African business thinkers and entrepreneurs to really focus their minds on what needs to be done. Absolutely.
It's a motivator for the society.
And it's a nice way of flagging up, hey, there's a crisis here in the offing. We need to work more collectively together. Whether they do or not, only time will tell.
This may be a clever way to go for the president of South Africa. In Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa's government has technically de-dollarized the economy by reintroducing local currency bank accounts, which will only be financed by more taxes on the transacting public. People are bound to moan, Vuyiswa.
Yeah.
But does he have a choice in what the path he's taken?
I don't think he does, you know, on a practical level as well as ideologically, because if you know the background of ZANU-PF's ideological pull, you know, throughout the years, is, you know, the reason why Zimbabwe is in such an economic turmoil is precisely because they stood firm on that. Whether you like Mugabe's style of working or not, the philosophical base is what's being protected here. And by de-dollarizing, moving away from the dominance of Western economics, what Zimbabwe is doing is actually giving Zimbabweans a chance to make that wonderful sounding theory of more economic independence a reality. And it really depends on how Mnangagwa's government can sell it to the people on that basis.
So you're saying this isn't the action of a man on the back foot, but this is a man who's actually creating a choice for himself to steer a new future?
I think so, because also being on the back foot is also a catalyst to actually get more clear thinking on alternatives. And this is an alternative model to break away from that IMF dependency that we talked about earlier with South Africa.
The problem with the ZANU-PF mold, that the kind of left model, is that it does require heavy taxation.
Yes.
And the truth is, nobody loves taxes. So do you expect any kind of pushback from the public about this? It's going to be financed by heavier taxes.
Most definitely, especially the MDC will certainly use it as a whip to constantly beat ZANU-PF with.
Right.
But I think
That's the opposition party.
That's the opposition, MDC,
Right.
Movement for Democratic Change.
Right.
But I don't know whether what they would do on a financial level would be good for Zimbabwe, because they'd most likely roll towards the IMF for assistance. Now, anyone going against that trend is pioneering and is in unknown territory. And I really think if they can sell it to the people on that basis, Zimbabweans have tightened their belts before, but if they know they're tightening their belts for a longer term good intention, it will work.
It's a question of how they sell it then for you.
Yeah.
After a 13-year suspension, it's been revealed that the World Bank will provide $1 billion in direct budget support to Ethiopia in the next few months. Now, many may be shocked by this, Vuyiswa, but should they be?
Yeah, some analysts may see that as a motivator for this kind of huge investment, but I think it's Ethiopia's reward for its loyalty, effectively, in terms of policy and its relationship and how it's economically wedded, especially to the United States, who have poured in significant amounts of money. And I think this is a kind of signal to say, well, we have faith in this African economy. Let's see what they can do with it. But it gives the Ethiopian government a little bit more wriggle room, which is important.
Which is fine. But many people see these sorts of financial supports as a golden handcuff, which then shackles you to a situation, and debts aren't gifts. They have to be paid.
Exactly
back.
like that same dynamic we're talking about, IMF and all these different bodies. But I think that the Ethiopian government has decided to, well, take a punt, a gamble on it, because they need wriggle room to actually be able to make their policies a reality for the population so that they can stay in power.
Excellent. Now, it does beg the question of productivity, because unless the Ethiopian economy becomes productive, it won't be able to service these budget deficits, will it?
Right. Well, then it's a question like, all economies of, just how effective the internal infrastructure mechanisms are, the transparency levels, the encouragement particularly of smaller business entrepreneurial skills.
And, I can't help thinking the commonality of these issues across the continent.
Precisely.
From the Horn of Africa all the way to South Africa.
Exactly.
We're talking similar issues.
And really, we're talking about different philosophical approaches to how you distribute wealth. Capitalism is very much about grow or die, and it seems to be at any price, including human well-being.
Very interesting. I hope the rest of the continent is taking notes. The price of oil is projected to reach $100 per barrel, prompting investors to pour into the commodity before fresh US sanctions against Iran bite at the beginning of November. The question has got to be, Vuyiswa, who benefits from the projected price hike?
Well, Saudi Arabia will definitely benefit, won't they? And I find it really interesting that for the first time in many years, Iran is at the table with other fellow OPEC members. And they can't reach agreement, and it's most likely that they won't, because they're trying to limit the production of oil to a certain number. I think it's 1 billion barrels per day.
Right.
And they're trying to get Iran to agree to that, but I don't think Iran will agree, which I find it quite ironical.
Isn't it
actually.
ironic?
Yeah.
But the Saudis have actually come forward to say that in the event of prices going completely haywire, they are prepared to step up production to make for the shortfall.
Well, yeah, let them. They win either way, don't they?
It seems so. But do you think that people are reading the wider picture that seems to be unfolding here, that this oil price hike will likely benefit the United States and her economic partners, if you like, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia being one of the latest?
Sure, but it's also part of that short-term thinking, and also limited thinking, like, oh, there's only a certain amount of resources and we've got to hang on to it, and, that thinking creates these kind of policies, and bodies like OPEC and we as consumers are literally at the mercy of whatever political dynamics are at play. But I do think it'll bite the US in the ass, so to speak, past the short-term level.
Because
when
these
gas
things always
prices
have,
go up.
yeah, well, no, these things always have long-term consequences downstream for other people.
Yeah.
What advice do you think that America's allies should be giving her in relation to these sanctions on Iran?
Well, I don't think America will listen if you sort of take Donald Trump as a benchmark of ability to be diplomatic on any level. I think they'd want them to just slow it down and be more cooperative in your thinking. Whereas the American way at the moment seems to be our way or the highway. And once that starts to get the kickback of not being efficient, and it won't be long, I reckon within a year, we're going to see much more of that kickback coming in. And then we'll have much more, shall we say, adult, multi-level discussions about these topics.
I think the world will put that on their wish list. Fouisswa, as ever, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us. Join me in part 2 when my guest, Andrew Nevin, explains his new way of looking at economics, what he calls Nevinomics, and how its application can revolutionise the business world. See you in a few moments. Welcome back to The Business, the show that breaks down business and its impact on Africa and Africans around the world. I'm joined today by Andrew Nevin, a leading global thinker, economist, and the creator of Nevinomics. Graduating from Western University at age 17, Andrew went on to gain 31 years' experience in a number of roles, from line manager to strategy consultant. He's currently focused on transforming the world's economy as an advisory partner to PricewaterhouseCoopers in Nigeria and through Nevinomics. Now, you wouldn't have learnt about Nevinomics at school because it didn't exist. But since Andrew created it, it's been taking the world by storm. Thanks for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here.
Dr. Nevin. What is Nevinomics and what does it offer the average businessman?
Well, Nevinomics comes out of work I did on my PhD decades ago, which I left, and I came back about 10 years ago, and I said to myself, what is the economy for? I mean, we have all of this writing, we have the business papers every day that tell us about the economy. But I think what economists have missed is what is the economy trying to accomplish? And Nevinomics said, well, it's actually trying to make people's lives better. If it's not making people's lives better, it's not functioning
So you're going
properly.
back to the fundamental assumptions.
All right. And then we pushed on and we said, okay, what does it mean for lives to be better? And we thought the best concept was the concept of human flourishing. So that's a person, personal growth, resilience, connectedness to other people, obviously material well-being, opportunities to do what they want. That's what the economy is for. So if it's not delivering that, it's not delivering what people need.
So Nevinomics is focusing on an assumption of persons which suggests that it's not just about the money, it's about human connectedness and all the other social needs that all human beings have.
Absolutely, and I think that what we found over the past few decades in many economies, GDP has increased, but people's satisfaction or happiness or flourish hasn't increased. So that presents a problem. Why doesn't that make people think about, if the GDP is increasing but people's well-being is not increasing, somehow there's a failure. But we haven't really addressed that yet.
But also in Africa, GDP is often not increasing and people are still miserable. So how does Nevinomics solve this conundrum?
Well, I think that for policymakers, they need to stop thinking about just GDP, because we've had it both ways. We've had GDP not increasing, people getting poorer, but we've also had GDP increasing. My country, Nigeria, the good years it increased 6-7%, but people's lives were not any better. So the metrics that we need to evaluate the economy, policymakers need to change. But I think we're making progress there. So if you think of something like the Sustainable Development Goals, we've tried to get one set of standards that looks beyond GDP. And so it looks at what's happening with income inequality, it looks what's happening with health, what's happening with education, and these all feed into human flourishing.
Okay, so those are the new metrics you'd like to measure. What does that mean for the average business person?
Well, I think that what you could see in Africa is, I mean, obviously a business needs to make profit, and profit's not a dirty word, it's just a reflection that there's more coming out of the business than going in, and that's a requirement for the business to be able to survive. But in terms of something like Nevinomics or human flourishing, I think a lot of business people realize their business needs to do more than just make a profit. So they start the business or they grow the business recognizing it needs to give good employment, it needs to produce products that make a difference to the communities, it needs to do this in a sustainable way. And then we're seeing a lot of support from the outside. So if you have a business that does all those things, that supports the Sustainable Development Goals or supports human flourishing, you're going to find it's easier to get funding, easier to get support, easier to get customers, and then of course social media is going to have a very positive view of your business.
Fantastic. Now, here's the problem for Africa. The Western model of development can't be replicated. But when the scramble for Africa took place, mostly European countries just absolutely launched into those colonies. All kinds of atrocities took place. The world has moved on. We live in a rules-based global community. Genocides aren't possible. Land grabs aren't possible anymore. Everything has to be done within the rule of law. So given those restrictions, how can Africans progress their companies without those restrictions, which actually Western companies had a long time ago? How can Africans progress their companies when they're actually kind of tied down by all these rules?
Well, I think as a starting point in sub-Saharan Africa, we're only going to be successful if Africans work with Africans, if Africans do business with Africans, if Africans trade with Africans. It's just mathematically impossible to have a prosperous society if our business model is digging up resources and sending them outside of the continent.
Sure.
So I think the starting point for businesses is to recognize it, and they need to support initiatives that bring Africans together. Now, you know, the result of colonialism, I live in Lagos in Nigeria, and you just think about the difficulties. We've got a French-speaking country, Cameroon, middle size. We've got a very large Nigeria. We have two small French-speaking countries, Togo and Benin. We've got Ghana. We've got Cote d'Ivoire, two English countries. We've got some Portuguese countries. The result of the colonial period has created something very difficult for us to be able to work together and to do business together. But we need to get over that and support things like the Continental Free Trade Agreement, abilities for Africans to work with Africans. And I think the businesses that do that and support that, they're going to find that our economies are not 2-3 times bigger in 10 years. They're 10, 15 times bigger.
Fantastic. So the first thing is collaboration on a kind of continental basis. The next thing is, what is the next step to lift large numbers of people out of poverty? Because that's got to be one of the goals.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in Nigeria, we've had a very difficult time, as you know. We've seen income per capita decline in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, probably 2019, 2020. Very difficult situation. We need to be materially prosperous, more prosperous. Africans need to be richer.
Is the question.
So I think that actually, to me, one of the most critical things is I think that not everyone on the continent actually understands that we need a bigger private sector. Now, the private sector has lots of problems, but it's a little bit like Churchill said about democracy. It's a terrible system except for everything else. Yes. There's no prosperity without a large private sector. And I think part of the blockage right now is, I would say, maybe 80% of the people, political class that I'm familiar with understand that, but the other 20% don't quite, there's no path forward without a larger private sector.
Okay, I'm going to move on. That's a larger private sector. It's an important point. The next thing is, how do you raise capital without losing your freedom? I mean, these are the immediate obstacles that face not only African businessmen, but also the nations that they belong to.
Right, so if you import foreign capital, I mean, it's always a danger to you. You have an obligation to foreigners. We know there's some concern now that there's debt, or the Chinese, for example, and other dollar debts that we've had. I actually think that the solution for Africa's capital comes from within. So there's this concept of dead capital. So in particular around real estate. If you don't have proper title, then you're not going to invest in your land if you don't know you own it. If the bank doesn't know you own it, they're not going to give you a mortgage.
Absolutely.
If the securities market doesn't know you don't own it, they're not going to securitize it.
Surely not.
And so the fact that the land is not liquid creates real problems. So someone has a parcel of land, everyone around them knows they own it. Yeah. But if they want to sell it and go live with their sister and start a business on the other side of Lagos, it's not possible. If we unlock the dead capital in real estate in Africa, we'll have enough capital for us to prosper.
There is another question that comes to mind repeatedly, and it underlies many of our difficulties on the continent: productivity. If people aren't productively employed in the jobs that they do, they can't create value for their companies. Their companies can't pay them a living wage, and the cycle continues. How do you raise productivity in Africa right now?
Well, I think I've heard a lot of people talk about SMEs and supporting SMEs, and I think that's important. But I actually think what's more important is supporting big companies. So these are both African champions, so companies like Dangote, or even global companies that come in, companies like Unilever, Diageo, that are all over the continent, because they actually raise the standards. They train people to a very high standard, and then many of them, of course, go on to work for Indigenous or start Indigenous companies that work at a higher standard. But it's very hard, I think, to go the SME route to raise productivity, because SMEs tend to be less productive.
Absolutely.
So we need the big champions, particularly the big African champions,
To step up.
to do that and do the training, enforce the standards, teach people how to work in a professional environment. And then when they have it there, they'll go out and do other things
Start
at the
their own
same level.
SMEs, maybe. Last question, and if you could be very quick with this. Human capital. None of this is going to happen without the human beings to change their mindset. What is the key ingredient that's required in Africa's human capital to unleash Nevonomics?
Well, it's always education, and start early. The most important thing is the primary education. People get a foundation. Once they have a foundation, they can go in many directions. The university route, vocational training, which I'm very big on to help drive development. But where the investment should be coming, to the extent that we take outside foreign help, the investment should be in primary education.
Primary and secondary
And
education,
secondary.
going
But-
forward
but
into
it's-
skills-based education
yes.
and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Thanks very much for joining us on the show, Andrew. And sadly, that's all we have time for. So that's it from me, Ted Kofi, Vuiswa Ngobongwana, and my special guest, Andrew Nevin. Now, don't forget, the business is now online, so wherever you are in the world, go to yangatv.com to check out every single episode. Goodbye.